Hi, and thank you for joining today's really important webinar on stress, burnout, and loneliness. I'm Eric Michrowski, President and CEO of Propulo Consulting, also a show host on a Safety Guru podcast. And a lot of the last few months, we've been working with a lot of different organizations, partnering with a lot of mid-sized to Fortune 500 organizations, helping them lead their safety cultures, helping them navigate through these difficult times of COVID-19. And one of the dominant themes that kept coming up was really around this topic of the increased stress, burnout, loneliness, and the challenges were happening in the organizations, which is really where this webinar came about. A couple weeks back, Madison and I were recording a podcast show on this very topic, and we decided to bring this to a different audience, really sharing some of the phenomenal findings and research that she's found in this space. So particularly as we've embraced remote work, that has really become a real dominant topic of conversation. So I'm really excited today to have with me Madison Hanscom, Madison Hanscom, who is a Chief Science Officer for Propulo. Within her role, she's responsible for our science team, coordinates all of our research efforts within the safety culture space, and tries to bring real tangible examples to organizations. So Madison, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, Eric, thanks for having me. Yeah, happy to be on.
Excellent. So we'll look forward to hearing a little bit about your thoughts on this space, and we'll try to make this conversation as interactive as possible. So if you've got some questions you'd like us to answer, some themes that maybe you'd like to answer to join in from the conversation items, we encourage you to ask questions through the question interface, and I'll try to be bringing those forward as Madison presents. Thank you, Madison.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Yeah, and there will be some opportunities when I would love to hear examples from the audience, would love to hear maybe what you've done as personal strategies individually, or some strategies at your company that you think is doing really well. So there'll be plenty of opportunities. We would love to hear from you in the chat. Thanks. So yeah, so this slide here, I want to set the stage quickly. So as I'm sure you've seen, a lot of studies have been coming out recently showing extremely similar trends to what's on the slide. There's substantial evidence to support that there is an increase in mental health issues this year in 2020. On the slide here, it says compared to 2018, those sampled in 2020 were 8 times more likely to fit the criteria for serious mental illness. And some groups are struggling more than others here. So in 2018, only 4% of individuals between 18 and 29, for instance, reported serious mental distress. However, in 2020, this is much higher. So it jumped from 4% to 38%. And this is a similar trend for people in their 30s and early 40s as well. So especially for those who have young kids at home, they actually, in the study here, they parse out the sample to look at those with kids and those without children. And there's a big gap there as well. So as you can imagine, having your kids out of school during this time, it's just really putting a strain on a lot of individuals. So Eric, if you go to the next slide, please.
That's astounding.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So I want to start this section by reading you a really powerful excerpt from a paper written by researchers at the Center for Cognitive and Social Neuroscience. So it says, imagine a condition that makes people irritable, depressed, and self-centered, and it's associated with a 26% increase in the risk of premature mortality. Imagine, too, that in industrialized countries, around a third of people are affected by this condition, with 1 person in 12 affected severely, and that these proportions are increasing. Income, education, sex, and ethnicity are not protective, and the condition is contagious. The effects of the condition cannot be attributed to some peculiarity of the character of a subset of individuals. They're a result of the condition affecting ordinary people. So what is this condition? It's loneliness. So it's interesting stuff. It's really serious, but we don't really talk about it all that often. And Eric, if you go to the next slide, please. And the definition of loneliness might seem really obvious, but it actually isn't, because if you think about it, somebody can work in a huge company. You might sit on a desk on a floor of 100 other workers, but you can still be lonely. And conversely, there could be somebody working entirely remotely from home, and maybe they're not lonely at all. So it's all about the quality and the meaningfulness of relationships when we're talking about loneliness in research. So if you're not actually connecting with someone, or you feel like you couldn't call somebody for help, things like that, that means that you could be lonely. And also sometimes it can involve rejection as well. So somebody feels outcasted by those they work with. Things like that can also contribute to this definition of loneliness. And it's becoming more and more of a problem. So some research has come out that shows that over the last 2 decades, we've actually decreased in the number of people we feel like we can confide in. The number of people saying there's no one with whom they can discuss important matters, personal matters, has actually tripled since the 80s. And there's a lot of theories as to why this is the case. Now it seems like we might have more friends but we can connect with them less deeply, right? So it's kind of like we have a higher quantity and less quality. Some people say that social media is killing intimate friendships. Some other people have been saying that we don't belong to as many social clubs. Like there used to be more clubs associated with the workplace as well. And we spend less time with family, things like that. But regardless, the punchline here is that people are feeling more isolated. And there's a lot of implications associated with this. And now, of course, with social distancing and increasing remote work, it's going to be a lot more of a problem now than ever before. So when we talk about loneliness too, something else to think about is a sense of kind of learned helplessness that can evolve over time. Researchers have actually found that once you've felt lonely for a long time at work, like you might feel that meaningful social connections are not actually going to happen at all. So then you kind of withdraw and give up on building interpersonal relationships entirely. So then it can kind of become a vicious cycle. So really important stuff. Eric, if we can move to the next slide, please.
Definitely.
And so the next slide here are kind of showing us the reasons why should we care. So, we talked about what loneliness is and that it's becoming more pervasive, but we should care because there's a lot of negative consequences associated with loneliness. So on the left here, we have physical and mental consequences. So social isolation actually registers in our brain like pain. It's also correlated with depression, generalized anxiety, suicidal ideation, burnout. It releases stress hormones that are related to high blood pressure, really serious stuff. Also, measuring these outcomes in older adults compared to non-lonely individuals, lonely people are more likely to suffer from cognitive decline, and actually Alzheimer's disease progresses more quickly in these individuals as well. And they also have a lower life expectancy. So loneliness is a predictor of all types of mortality or premature death. So very serious here. Also, there's workplace consequences. In an average month, lonely workers think about quitting their job more than twice as often as non-lonely workers. So, there could be some turnover implications there, which we know is very, very expensive for companies. And also, when somebody's lonely, they're less likely to be committed to their company in general, and they also have lower job performance. So different types of job performance measures as well. So task performance, team performance, etc. So that really kind of lays a scene for, wow, we should really care about this. So the next slide here, this is going to be one of those situations or one of these slides where we would love to hear from you. So I'm going to go through some suggestions for what anybody can do for loneliness. But at the end of the slide, we would love for you to submit your own success stories in the chat. It might be a personal example, might be something from your company, but either way, we would love to hear from you. And when I kind of talk through strategies, what I'm usually going to do is I'm going to talk about ideas for everyone, ideas for employees, etc., and then also kind of ideas for leaders. So there'll be another slide after this for leaders. So, okay, so the first one here is getting creative when it comes to engaging with others at work. So social support at work is related to more satisfaction, more productivity, less stress and burnout. So it's really important to build positive social connections at work. There's a lot of ways to do this. You might organize activities. So these might look different if you're working in a virtual versus a non-virtual environment, of course, but they might be happy hours. You might have like a sports team, like a kickball team or a Friday fun run. You might do lunches. A lot of virtual environments are doing really fun webcam birthday celebrations. Like you might send a cake to somebody's house and all celebrate, fun things like that. Also, another really great way to engage with others is peer coaching. So this is creating a network of allies. you can talk about things that are work related, sometimes non-work related, and you might want to be accountability buddies, set goals together, things like that. But ultimately, connections like that, groups like that, build those partnerships, build connections, which can help loneliness. Something I really like that people have been doing more of, but I'd like to see more, is integrating icebreakers into meetings. So this means, maybe taking the first 3 minutes of each phone call or meeting, and it can be informal. You might just asking somebody how their weekend was, or you can have like silly questions that you ask people, like your dream vacation, what's your favorite food, things like that. And you might also try to organize company retreats so people can get to know each other outside of a work environment. If you're working remotely, it's a good way to build strong personal relationships that then carry over to the virtual environment. So things like that can be a way to engage others. And then another one is onboarding buddies. So let's say a new employee is coming in, volunteer to be their onboarding buddy. And if you're a new employee yourself, ask for one. So sometimes companies don't already have this in place and you have to advocate for yourself, but it's such a great way to build connections at work. The next point here is limit social media. So I really liked this one. So there's a really interesting study where researchers randomly assigned people to one of two groups. The first group was a control group, and they were asked to just do everything as normal, use your social media like normal. And then the second group was the intervention group, and they were only allowed to use it for a maximum of 10 minutes a day. And so this included everything. This included Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, all of it. And when after 3 weeks of this intervention, the experimental group, the group that had reduced social media time, had really great results compared to the control group. There was a significant reduction in anxiety and fear of missing out and loneliness. So really interesting here, because it's kind of counterintuitive, right? Like you would think that if you're spending time on social media, you would feel less lonely, but the research actually didn't show that. It showed that less social media can actually, help you feel less lonely. So I thought that was really interesting, and it makes a lot of sense. Okay, so also the next bullet point here is bring compassion to work. We really damper our emotions a lot at work. This is what society tells us is professional. This is what society tells us is appropriate. So it can be difficult to just see how somebody is doing on the exterior. So maybe checking in, asking people how they're doing, whether it's on a work call or in the break room, it goes a really long way just to ask, because you can't just look at somebody and tell. And there's countless stories of somebody asking this question to a coworker, and then somebody realizes, wow, I haven't been asked how I'm doing in months. So it's all about being a part of a supportive environment where we can look out for each other at work, because it's, in way too many work environments, everybody is just a coworker and not actually supportive in any type of way. The next bullet point, seek relationships outside of work. So sometimes you might just not click with the people you work with, and that's completely fine. Maybe they're really different from you, or maybe you really like them, but maybe they have young children and they're incredibly busy, and this happens. And yeah, completely normal. And in these circumstances, I would try to build relationships or find fulfillment outside of work, kind of as a supplement. So just an important thing to think about. And then also, of course, talking to a therapist and or your doctor is very important. So those who have a deep, pervasive sense of loneliness, consider seeking cognitive behavioral therapy. A meta-analysis is a study that compiles research findings from many, many studies on a topic. So a meta-analysis came out a few years ago showing they compiled research on loneliness interventions, and they found that the most impactful interventions were treatments that focus on maladaptive social cognition. So these are negative thoughts about self-worth, how other people perceive you, etc. So cognitive behavioral therapy helps to get to the root of the problem and help people to pull themselves out of kind of a downward spiral. So therapy is really great. It's a really good resource, and certainly something the individuals should look into. And finally, the last bullet point, I thought this one was really important, and it's quality over quantity. So don't worry about making friends with everyone, because research shows that having one solid friendship at work can be enough. Literally just a single close work relationship can really fill the gap and determine whether you are lonely or you're not lonely. So Yeah, really important stuff. So right here, we would like to pause for a second and see if anybody from the audience has any ideas, strategies, suggestions for individual loneliness.
And thank you, Madison. I'll start. There's two that have been lined up, and again, if you've got some others, please share those questions or those ideas, I should say in the questions tab. The first example that somebody submitted is, I got a dog. I work from home and spend a lot of time alone, and having someone else in the house has been really great for my morale. I also get out for more walks, so it's been a win-win for me. So that's a great example. Having had a dog in my life before, definitely can be a great example. The second one is, I learned that someone I work with lives pretty close to me, so we started carpooling to work together to save on gas money, but it's also great for social connections. So those are two themes that came in through the chat window. If you've got some others, feel free to share them, but I don't see any others at the moment, so maybe we can proceed to your next slide.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, I really like the carpool one. Yeah, it kind of kills a lot of birds with one stone. It's good for building a new social connections, good for the environment. It's good for everything. So that's a really cool one. So
it's a win-win-win.
Yes, love that. Okay, so the next slide. So similar, we're still talking about loneliness here, but this slide kind of targeted to suggestions for executives and entrepreneurs. Executives really influence everything from stock prices to frontline employees. So we really need these individuals to be mentally healthy and really to take care of themselves. But of course, as we know, it's not easy being an executive. A lot of them are burning the candle at both ends. And they also have to deal with a lot of failure, especially entrepreneurs. So entrepreneurs, there's a lot of numbers floating around, but one I see often is that 3 out of 4 venture-backed startups fail. And things like this really take a toll on someone. So we've wrapped so much of our identity into work. And when something fails, it feels like we are a failure. And it's true that CEOs and entrepreneurs, when going through tough times, they're likely experiencing difficulties that a lot of people can't relate to or understand. And this can feel very isolating. And it's too easy to struggle with depression, anxiety, loneliness when feeling like you have to hide from your colleagues, like you have to hide your failures, your struggles, your emotions from, your employees, the board, basically any network like that. So it is tough. And executives might feel like they carry the whole burden of their employees' negative emotions on their shoulders. They might take on a lot of ownership when things go wrong, even when things are completely out of their control. So right now with this situation we're in with COVID, there's a lot of really struggling businesses, and executives or, CEOs take a lot of that on. So CEOs, executives, entrepreneurs, consider all the tips on the previous slide and take care of yourself, because all those things work for everyone. We're all human. Executives are just people like everyone else. So you need to eat right, use stress management tools, build social connections, all those important things. And then there's also other resources specific for you. So there are CEO or entrepreneur support groups that you can join. These can be found on LinkedIn, for instance. And it can just be really good to talk to other individuals who understand your situation and what you're going through. So seeking out that support group might be really helpful. And also, never underestimate the power of speaking with a therapist. A trained professional can work with you to build cognitive tools, for psychological wellness, things like that. So there's somebody you can also be vulnerable with if you feel like you don't have that outlet in your life, because it's completely confidential. And the last thing I would mention is, when you as a leader, when you build positive culture around well-being, you are signaling to others that it's valued and acceptable to prioritize mental health. So on the slide here, the 2 bullet points, the first one is take care of yourself, because that just really shows that it's a value, because you're walking the talk. And the second one is to take care of your people, take care of your employees. Like I said earlier, loneliness is really tough because you can't just look at someone and tell that they're lonely from the outside. Even though you might have an employee lives alone and they work remotely all the time, there's no way for you to actually know whether they are lonely or not unless they tell you. So to play it safe, just the best thing to do is to build a supportive social climate where people have strong social ties at work. Because research shows that a climate that supports positive relationships is going to benefit everyone. It's going to trickle all the way down and up the company. So it'll help to reduce loneliness and increase productivity. And this is contrary to the belief that managers should create competitiveness between employees. This is not a practice that supports the well-being of workers. So consider how social support, social ties can be integrated into daily actions with employees and HR practices. An example might be onboarding. Onboarding is an extremely important time where people build connections. During this time, they're either going to feel apart or disconnected from the company. So pay special attention to new employees when it comes to embedding them into the culture. But of course, you also want to think about your employees who've been around a long time. So show you're thinking about them too, and that you appreciate them whenever possible. So it might just be a quick text message to let them know they did an awesome job on a client call, something like that. Goes a really long way. So again, here's another point where I know that we have some leaders in the audience. So we would love to know, what are things that you've done for your own well-being, or things that your company has done to facilitate well-being, loneliness, anything of the like. Curious if you have any examples, Eric.
Yeah, and actually, I'll just, before I go to some audience items, I'll just share, because I spend a lot of time speaking to a lot of CEOs, and it's a different weight than many of them are carrying. Like, a lot of them, particularly in difficult times like we're going through right now, feel that they're carrying the weight of the success and the well-being of their entire workforce, which means that they, on their shoulders, are trying to make decisions in ambiguous times, but they feel that the impact will be on so many different people, and some people don't necessarily appreciate or understand that. It's a lot of to carry for somebody. And the other thing is some CEOs today, when you talked about entrepreneurs, they're also very committed at a completely different level. Like, there's a CEO I knew that his company failed, but he had put everything into it. So when it failed, it wasn't like losing your job where you can go to unemployment insurance. He lost his house because he had tied in his mortgage, everything that he owned, his car, everything, to the company. And when it failed, he basically had to start all over again. So that can carry a lot more weight on somebody's shoulders. The other element I would throw in there as well, in terms of the resources, executive coaches as well, that can be resources available to people. So just one of the items that came in on the chat in terms of an example that lined up is, somebody said, I love this one, it says, I personally like to practice gratitude. It helps me a lot throughout my day when I make a mental list of all the things I'm thankful for. Plus, it also puts things into perspective for me and keeps me grounded. And I know that's something that I try to practice even myself on a daily basis, is I'll try to reflect back on the top 2 or 3 things that I'm most grateful for as I start my day. So I think that's a really good example.
Yeah, that is a great example. Thanks everyone for sharing.
Okay, and I think that's all we've got. So maybe we can continue to talk a little bit about stress.
Great. So this slide here, it shows the same person who's kind of looking energized and then who's kind of looking defeated, right? So what this slide is meant to show is that there are good types of stress and bad types of stress. Good stress is very energizing. In the research, we call these challenge stressors. These might be stressful temporarily, but they usually promote personal growth in the long run. And these are related to good outcomes like career progression, job satisfaction, growth, things like that. But then there's negative stress that's brought on by hindrance stressors. And these are things that we don't really have the resources to meet. These actually hurt our professional development, and these are negatively related to job satisfaction, bad for our well-being. These stressors might look like sexual harassment or injustice in the workplace, role conflict, way too much on our plate that we just can't handle, things like that. So I just wanted to start here just by illustrating the point that not all stress is created equal, because some stress is okay, it's part of growth, and work would be really, really boring if there was no stress at all. So just kind of something to keep in mind. And moving to the next slide, kind of thinking about where remote work fits into all of this. Eric, if you could go to the next slide.
Yep.
right now, tons of people are working remotely who are not normally working remotely. They're not used to it. And people who were already working remotely previously are, of course, still working remotely, but a lot of them are doing it with different circumstances. So now, like, even though you might have been working remotely previously, maybe now you're doing it with a kid, or you're doing it with more job insecurity, or a lot of uncertainty, or different financial implications. Maybe a partner doesn't have a job. So just really difficult time. Usually remote work is actually pretty good when it comes to stress and exhaustion. Research shows teleworkers report less stress in many studies, and also less emotional exhaustion. And some researchers say this might be because remote workers are able to stockpile their resources because they don't waste a bunch of time commuting, things like that. And they're more flexible to meet family demands. So, excuse me, if I need to sneeze, I'm going to put on mute. Sorry about that. Okay. So right now, things are really unusual with the pandemic and economic uncertainty. So people who are working remotely are also more stressed than usual. There's a recent study that was conducted in April and May of this year that identified aspects of work that are most significantly correlated with poor psychological stress in a sample of remote workers. Eric, if you go to the next slide, I think I have the characteristics that were listed. Perfect. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So in the study, they asked a whole bunch of people who were working remotely, what's contributing to psychological distress. So they're listed here. The first one is technical issues. So I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm personally in a constant battle with my Wi-Fi connection that was not happening before COVID. Everybody's working from home now. So this is, to no surprise, something that researchers are finding to be a stressor for those working from home. Also, the next one is really important. It's close monitoring and distrust. So the researchers found that for those workers experiencing even higher or very high distress, 26% of them felt that their managers did not trust them. I don't have enough time to actually dive deeply into this topic. We actually have a great blog post that discusses close monitoring and the negative impact on employee performance. So feel free to email me if you're interested and I can send it to you. But we don't want to breathe down our employees' necks because that makes it look like we don't trust them. The next one is underload. And this is not having enough to do, but being expected to work. So this really happens when people are suddenly forced into a remote role, but many of their previous tasks did not really translate into a remote working environment. So they don't have a whole lot to do. So, for instance, maybe previously they were stocking shelves or doing something, and now that doesn't really translate. So they don't really have another task to fill that time while they're working remotely. So that's been a problem for people. And boredom is not really a luxurious situation. It's really anxiety provoking for people. Workers want to be stimulated and they want to be contributing meaningful work. So it's really important for leaders to work with employees to make sure this is happening. The next one speaks for itself, job security. People are really fearful that they're going to lose their job or be furloughed. So uncertain about the future. The next one's poor communication. Again, this is something people are still trying to master. Communicating in a virtual setting. For example, some people are having issues where colleagues are coming across as really short in emails and maybe they're misinterpreting tones as being rude or annoyed. So, on an interpersonal level, just really learning how to navigate new communication styles. And the last one, we've talked about it a couple of times, but work-home interference. So a lot of people now have kids and partners at home, and it's unusual and difficult. So I thought that this was a really interesting study. And just to mention too, at the very end of this presentation, all these research studies I'm mentioning, they're all in the references. So we have all of those for you if you're interested. If we can move to the next slide, please.
Absolutely.
This is another, thanks, Eric. This next slide, perfect. What can we do about stress? So again, I'm going to talk about some strategies for everyone. This is another opportunity where we would love to hear from the audience. So while I'm talking, if you can think about things that you have done that worked really well or that your company's doing, please share. We would love to hear. So, but yeah, before I get into these, so the right solutions for you are going to depend on your source of stress or your set of stressors. Some people are stressed for completely different reasons. Some are because they're bored or they're not stimulated enough. Others might be stressed because they have way too much going on, they're overloaded. So these people will need different solutions. Regardless though, something to think about with stress is whether or not your solutions are primary or tertiary or secondary. What I mean by this is asking yourself the question, am I fixing the root of the problem, or am I fixing the result, or like the side effect of the problem? And it's better to think of strategies that fix the root of the problem, or primary interventions, because those are going to help you much more down the road. For instance, if you're really bored at work, we can do something called job crafting, and that actually helps you think that your work is less boring. So it's actually helping the problem. However, sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes your stressor is like a really tight deadline that's out of your control, or it's a rude coworker or a difficult boss, and you can only use secondary strategies like meditation, deep breathing to deal with it after the fact. Obviously, it's not ideal because the stressor will always be there and you're not really changing anything, but at least you're building resources in your toolbox to deal with it on a regular basis. So these strategies here, we have self-care. So these are the foundational things, often overlooked, but it's such a shame because the research shows time and time again, the things like sleep, eating right, exercising, limiting alcohol, things like that are incredibly related to stress, well-being, productivity at work. I mean, really related to everything. I think sleep in particular, we're actually going to be releasing a really, really helpful podcast on sleep with a great researcher, but it impacts everything and people just take it for granted, but it's easy to do. We're in a busy time. So self-care is really important. Next is micro breaks. So after you've been concentrating really, really hard on a task for maybe a few hours or something, it doesn't make sense to immediately shift and concentrate really hard on something else to the point to where you're just exhausted and just feeling scorched at the end of the day. So you have to take micro breaks. Research shows that these really increase productivity, reduce stress. They also can reduce the risk of making mistakes or getting into accidents. And these might look different from everyone depending on your job, of course, and where you work, but it could be as simple as just taking 5 deep breaths or going to get a cup of coffee, just looking out the window for a second. My favorite one is to return a text message really quick, but you always have to avoid getting sucked into a 30-minute social media hole, of course. These micro breaks are only meant to be, like a 5-minute type thing, not a productivity suck. They're just help you make your brain reset. So if you're starting to feel negative or have signs of cognitive depletion, like yawning, this means you need a break. I know personally, if I just push through my signs that I'm starting to get cognitively depleted, my work takes me twice as long to get it done. Whereas if I just took a second, took a few deep breaths, took a lap around my house and came back and sat down, I would finish that work twice as quickly. So it's important to listen to our signs here. The next one is to process your emotions. So sometimes we like to stay really, really busy so we don't have to confront our stress or confront our emotions. And this might work for a little while, but over time, it can be pretty detrimental. So it's important to slow down, be mindful about how you're feeling and why. It's okay to be struggling. Emotional processing is really important. So whether it's talking to somebody you trust, journaling independently, your therapist, think about how you can process what you're feeling. The next one is focus on what you can control. A common tendency when dealing with stress is to ruminate on stressors. The thoughts like, when will the economy be back to normal? When will my kids go back to school? Things like that. And these thoughts are normal, but they can really stir up anxious feelings. So although there's a lot of events currently happening right now that we cannot control, like when will my kid go back to school? What we can control is the way we structure our thoughts around them. So I'm not sure when my kid will go back to school, but I'm going to enjoy the extra time I have with her in the meantime. So try everything you can to remind yourself what you do have influence over and what you don't. Something that works really well is just making a list. So in one column, you have all the things you cannot control, the economy, politics, others' opinions, the past, and then all the things that you can control. Whether or not you can ask for help, the goals you set, how you treat others, when you exercise, etc. So it can go a long way. And finally, the last bullet here is job crafting. So I mentioned this earlier, and job crafting is exactly what it sounds like. You are crafting your job, and the purpose is to increase fit, between your work and your interests. And there's a lot of different ways you can job craft. You can increase structural resources. So these are the aspects of your job that help you to achieve goals. So let's say you really want some personal development opportunities in your life, but there's not a ton going on in your company. So you can take it on yourself to, make your own 360 feedback system. It might be pretty low budget. You might just use email or the phone or something, but you might just seek out feedback from different people you work with just to get that development that you've been craving. Another one might be increasing challenges in your work. So I have a good friend who really wanted to get better with a certain aspect of computer programming in her job. So she asked her boss if she could take an online course on a new programming language. And to her surprise, they were really supportive of her learning that new skill. And she had to come up with the idea, and she had to plan it and speak up and ask for it. But she was able to add some stimulation into her job by learning a new programming language. So kind of speaking up and learning a new skill can be awesome. Also, you can also think about how you can increase your social resources. So relationships are certainly resources as well. And think about how you can build and strengthen them. Perhaps you expand your network by offering to mentor someone or asking to be mentored. And another way to shape your social resources might be just to avoid toxic people. We know that dealing with people who are unhelpful or do not bring us good feelings can be very stressful. So you can actually craft your job just by avoiding certain people when it makes sense. And finally, you can also do cognitive crafting. So this one's really powerful. This cognitive crafting is all about how you frame your job and how your work fits into the bigger picture. This might involve thinking about your job in a different way. An example that's used often in the research literature with job crafting are cleaners in a hospital. So some custodians saw their jobs just as cleaning, and then others saw their job as being healers. They see their job as making the environment safe for people to heal, safe for people to recover and get well. And the example here is to consider, how does your work positively affect the larger community? And it gives you meaning. It puts things into perspective. So it's a really powerful idea there. It's all about reframing. So that's what I have for you here. And again, we would love to hear if anybody has any examples.
And while we're waiting for some examples, I just want to touch on job crafting. I was talking to one organization a couple of weeks back, and there was a particular pocket of the organization that was having very high level of stress as they were working remotely, and it was a very repetitive task that kept being run throughout the day. And one of the things that they try to do is actually distribute that repetitive task, which really I think fits into your job crafting example, so that there wouldn't be one person just constantly doing the same repetitive task. So with the working from home and everything else, it allowed a conversation around it. The issue which was there before surfaced, which created an opportunity. I also love the example you have, which was somebody taking personal ownership and saying, how do I introduce kind of additional tools and learning within my environment? So if I go to two stories that have been lined up. So the first one is a personal example that somebody shared in terms of they decided to cut back on drinking alcohol basically during the work week. So from Monday to Thursdays, and noticed that their sleep was way better and stress levels at work had been much lower. And they indicated that their husband also did it with them. So they both have lost weight on top of it. So that's a fantastic example. And another example that came up, which I think pulls to your micro breaks example, somebody referring to, I think it's called Pomodoro technique, which is really about kind of focused tasks for probably about 20, 25 minutes, then 5 minutes where you're moving away from your screen time. So really trying to schedule that. And I think they've got an app that seems to schedule it to look out the window, look outside at a distance, so relaxes the eyes, but also gives you a very, very short micro break at a repetitive interval. And some organizations on that idea that I've been talking to have been scheduling calls for 25 minutes or 55 minutes, just to allow 5 minutes of kind of decompression time, bathroom breaks or food intake in between meetings, as opposed to the traditional hour-long meetings that take place. So I think those are some really good examples, and I think that's it in terms of the cues. So Madison, maybe let's we can talk a little bit of some strategies for leaders.
Yeah, that's great. And so my first example is exactly what you were saying, is give people a moment to pause. And so that's exactly what Eric was saying. Instead of booking meetings for an hour, do it for 50, 55 minutes to give people a moment to breathe, bio break, things like that. There's a lot of running from back-to-back meetings or back-to-back tasks, and this is a great way to reset. So yeah, just along the lines of micro breaks. The next one is giving as much flexibility and autonomy as possible. So when you give people control over their work, it can be where their work is done, when, how it's done. This is great for well-being. I mean, well, for that matter, it's great for productivity. It's basically great for everything. People love to have some control over what they're doing when it makes sense. So it just shows you trust them, and you do have to make sure they have the right resources so they can actually do their work well autonomously. But this is something that really helps people. The next one is providing positive feedback. So let people know when they're doing a good job. A positive remark can make all the difference, and it brightens somebody's day. It's so tried and true, but it often slips through the cracks. Like, we forget to just recognize people, especially after somebody's been working at the company for a while. So just make sure to reassure people that they're doing a great job. It helps with the stress levels there. The next one is to improve communication and set expectations. So people want updates and they want to be connected to the big picture. So communicate well with people. The next one is share mental health resources. So this is very simple. It could just be distributing links, looking to your insurance plan to see if there's upgraded support in this time of need. There's also hotline numbers, virtual counseling that works really well. So just sharing things with people, it makes you helps employees know that you're thinking about it, you care about them, there's resources for them, just keeps the conversation going. It's really helpful. And then the last one is encourage employees to set boundaries. Not only should you encourage employees to set boundaries, but you should also respect them. So during a time like we're in right now, a time kind of crisis, we're often expected to accommodate work at all hours, depending on your job. But even though it can feel rewarding to do that at first, over time it can lead to less recovery, it can lead to exhaustion, things like that. So just remind employees it's okay to spend some hours offline. It's okay to disconnect from work. You really want them to rest and recuperate. You want them to know that it's okay if they don't respond to emails, on off hours, on weekends, things like that. You want them, even though a lot of us are working from home, that we still have home and work hours. So it's just a good way for people to reset. And so those were the strategies for leaders. And we were also curious if any listeners have any other examples, like from a leadership perspective when it comes to stress, anything you've done with your employees as a leader.
So there's two examples I lined up. The one is essentially an example of peer-to-peer, which I really like, and it's really about regularly touching base with colleagues that I'm comfortable with to see where I can have a conversation about our stress. It helps to feel more supported and less alone in what we're experiencing. I think that's a very good example of reaching out, create a sense of community, ties in a lot to some of the themes you talked about earlier. So I think that's a fantastic example. The other example that came up, I think is also really good, is somebody mentioned that you mentioned with telepressure, but I stopped sending my employees text messages after 6 p.m. unless it's an emergency. When we all transitioned to working from home, there was a moment where we seemed to all be talking at late hours just because there was more flexibility. But now I've realized that there needs to be a boundary so people can disconnect from work. So I think that's a really good example. The other one I've seen quite a bit I use is as well, trying to schedule when I send messages. So if I'm working late, that's my choice, but maybe I'm not going to ping an employee at 11 o'clock at night on a particular theme, because then they may think, oh my goodness, I need to respond right away. So delay send it, and then it shows up the next morning. Or as somebody had shared with me as more of a joke, they said, well, I schedule all my emails to pop in late at nights like that. I give the impression that I work late, but I'm not. That's a bad example.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, you get to think about the type of culture that you're sustaining with things like that. So yeah, that's a great example. Okay, so we can move on to burnout if those are the only two that you had.
Yeah, it is. And again, if you've got some other examples or best practices that you've seen as you've gone through, and as Madison shares some ideas, don't hesitate to queue up the questions in the question chat room or question area, and I'll bring them in even if it's on a prior slide. Would love to have more examples and ideas from the audience as well.
Yeah, oh, that's a great point. Thanks for saying that. Okay, so right here we have burnout. The reason I'm covering the topic burnout last is because chronic, prolonged loneliness and stress contribute to burnout over time. But of course, okay, just because you're living in stress does not mean that you will eventually burn out. I really wanted to go over the difference between things like stress and burnout because we shouldn't confuse them. Like I said earlier, some stress can actually be great and it shows we're engaged. But the more popular the term burnout gets, the more likely people are to think that they have it or somebody else has it. But burnout is really a serious mental health issue and it shouldn't be taken lightly. So we kind of have to avoid medicalizing everyday stress as burnout. So that's why we just kind of talk about the differences really quick. Burnout is never good. It's deep, it's pervasive, and it has a lot worse longer-term implications than stress. It is psychological strain that depletes someone's intrinsic resources over time. It leads to emotional exhaustion, physical fatigue, cynicism towards others, and depleted mental resources. And some of the main antecedents or some of the main predictors of burnout include a heavy workload, low control over work, and low support to meet demands, conflicts, wearing too many hats, ambiguity, all those things. So we should be concerned about burnout because it has a lot of negative outcomes like turnover, bad productivity, a lot of the same things with stress. But again, it's more over time. It's harder to bounce back from. And also burnout can be contagious. Studies have documented this process called emotional contagion, where really negative or really positive emotions can kind of spread around a company. The people who are particularly influenced are individuals who talk more about work problems. Those are people who are more perceptive to others' emotions. They can kind of pick up on that and it can kind of spread throughout a company. So it's really important to kind of think about these things. But the good news is burnout does not appear overnight. It takes time to develop. And so this can allow leaders to really get ahead of problems, check in, mitigate the situation before it becomes like a big setback. So we really want to make sure we have healthy employees for having a resilient workplace. So we could go to the next slide, please, Eric. Now that we've kind of talked about what burnout is, it's clear that this is not something that people just make up in their head. It's a product of a really overwhelming work environment. A common industry in which you see burnout is the medical field. Healthcare workers are getting overbooked. They're working long shifts. They talk about how there's more and more paperwork, but no time to complete it. So the point I'm trying to make here is that we can't just tell somebody to snap out of it. We usually have to make some legitimate, substantial changes to the work environment for anything to change. But I'm still going to talk about strategies for individuals and leaders. So I guess that spiel, what I'm trying to say is burnout is such a systematic issue where you actually need to make changes in the company. But these strategies, you shouldn't always put it on the individual, but we're still giving some individual strategies. So strategies for everyone. And again, we would like your suggestions after this slide as well. Mm-hmm. Think about everything we talk about for stress, because that also applies here. Because remember how really stressful work environments over time, prolonged, lead to burnout. And it's much better to tackle bad stress before it turns into something more serious, more depleting down the road. So it's important to take care of yourself. And remember that the way we talk impacts others. So when I was talking about that contagion, if there's a burnout problem, try to build each other up and stay positive. We've heard about people who have team meeting rules where there's no complaining allowed, like they have team rules or meeting rules, and that's one of their rules. So even if things are really difficult, staying positive when it comes to the things that we can't change and being proactive and changing the things we can control is a step towards success. So we have a client who does that, and we thought it was a pretty great idea. And also ask for help. people get really afraid to speak up when they need help because they want to come across as competent, but this can really wear on you over time. You have to speak up. And when you do speak up and ask for help, this signals to others that it's okay. Like it's promoting this mental health climate. And you might find also that there's a lot of people in the same boat. So it's all about building that culture of support. So does anybody have any ideas? Has their company done anything well? Have they done anything that works well for them?
So as we wait for some stories or some examples, I think that last point in terms of creating comfort around speaking up, encouraging people to highlight issues, very, very important, so that you've got essentially a line of defense around this as well. So one of the examples that came up, and again, if you've got some others, I encourage you to add them to the questions tab. But learning how to say no. I realized I was putting a lot of pressure on myself, and I'm an overachiever, so I have been learning to say no to extra projects that just eat up my free time. And if I can share another one as well that I actually had a client talking about earlier, is just even as a leader checking in with people to see how is the workload, how much do I have, am I balancing, or just checking in kind of a more personal level in terms of how they're doing and how the work is managing, because in some cases they realize that some of the examples like the one that was just shared in terms of overachievers, that some of the overachievers were sometimes interpreting that he needed to do an A+ job on everything, but certain things required A+, like for example, what was going to the board deck, but other things really just needed maybe a C grade, which is maybe just sufficient to just have maybe some talking points or some ideas, as opposed to a thorough slide deck that covers every detail. So I think that was a really good example. There's another one that's come in is my employer offers flexible work arrangements, so I can take my breaks when I need to without feeling guilty. So I think that's a really, really good example in terms of that flexibility. And I think this is something I know I learned probably personally, I was going to say probably about 15, 20 years ago, when I had a workforce that didn't like working from 9 to 5, and sometimes they would come in at 10 o'clock in the morning or 11. And at first, I'd been trained and brought up in a work environment where everybody had to be really structured from 8:30 to 5 or 5:30. And what it taught me is actually, at first, it seemed like the wrong thing, but then I realized they were just working the same amount of hours or sometimes more, but they wanted the flexibility on certain days to start a different time. And maybe that doesn't work if you're in a contact center where you need to take a call at a specific time, but when it's not necessary, that flexibility, I think, can give a lot of help for people. Any thoughts on that perspective, Madison?
It's exactly like you said. It just goes a long way. It's just shown in research to work. People love that resource. Yeah, it's great.
Some really, really good examples. So keep coming in with more ideas, more examples. Really love to share those. Perfect.
Great. So now the last slide here is strategies for leaders. So what can leaders do to help with burnout? Leaders definitely have more pull or more power when it comes to making changes that can contribute to a healthier work environment. So this is really important stuff. And the number one thing, when you think about burnout, the number one thing is to consider the balance between demands and resources. Demands are those things that we're required to do physically and emotionally, intellectually in our jobs. And resources are the things that we have in place to help us meet the demand. So that's why on this slide, there's this balance scale. And for instance, there's a group of individuals now being asked to sanitize work vehicles before and after a delivery that's required to take a half hour, which is a demand. And a resource for this would be having enough time and cleaning supplies to do this safely, comfortably, without racing against the clock. Because let's say during that 30-minute time window originally, they were supposed to do that same delivery without the sanitation. If you're introducing a practice like that, you have to give people time to use it. And there's also things that leaders can do to help employees strike that perfect balance between demands and resources. And to give them the resources, physical and psychological, that they need to get through work. So everything we covered on the stress slide applies to burnout too, of course, but I wanted to share a few more ideas. And the first one is checking in. So this is exactly what Eric had just talked about, where we need to be aware when workload and hours start increasing. And this is, especially when it's increased and then it's sustained over a long period of time, this is a big precursor to burnout. Once people are working outside of the hours they're expected. So you have to really check with your workforce. You have to see who's feeling stretched thin and why. And then while you're checking in, give people positive feedback. So we just talked about this, but it's a good way just to let people know they're doing a great job and ask if there's anything they need. So checking in is really big. And then another one, whenever you talk about burnout, I like to think about micro goals. So when people feel like things are really overwhelming or, there's not an end in sight, something that works really well is setting these little goals to just kind of segment the big picture into small, bite-sized, achievable tasks. They're really motivating for people. People feel like they're chipping away at something big. So getting serious about micro goals, that's really great. And something else I would mention is make sure you trust people and you don't tether people. So imagine the scenario where you're working from home, you wake up, you sit down at your computer with your coffee, and the first thing you see is that a customer is freaking out. So let's say they had a major incident related to your product and you've been frantically working with the client to fix it. And then a few hours later, you're done and you see that you have 6 text messages from your boss, you have missed calls from your boss and missed emails from your boss. And a few of these messages, they said, I expect you to be working, respond to me immediately. It's working hours. And they even accused you of sleeping in, and things like this really crush morale and they really squash trust. So like, this is the whole idea of you can't micromanage your employees, especially right now when so many people are working remotely. It's just really something to think about. That's highly related to burnout. Another example that comes to mind is I know a manager who proposed putting cameras up in home offices so they could watch people for accountability mechanisms. So just thinking about that is really important. And I have a few others. I realize we're running out of time. So any suggestions from the audience here when it comes to burnout?
So there's one as I'm waiting for thoughts to line up. One of them, two that I've been reinforcing is really back in probably about 2 or 3 decades ago, G was talking about this concept of ramp as a low-hanging fruit to remove things that are too much work when you need to, and it's really about the reports, the approvals, the meetings, the metrics, the policies, and the projects. So things that are typically low-hanging fruit, low value, that are easier to take out of the workload, that's a great way to look at it. And I have got some articles on that topic if you're interested, but just a clean sweep on some of the low-hanging fruit of pressures that could perhaps be removed. And the other one is starting each week with the big rocks, really thinking about the big rocks I want to move and moving with that intent. So one item that came in through the chat is we've had to adapt policies to fit new demands from COVID. Otherwise, people would be overloaded trying to use the old processes. So very much linked to what I was talking about in terms of ramp and in terms of coming up with ways to reduce the amount of work that people are faced with. So we've just got a couple more minutes. I figure maybe we go to Q&A and see if we can catch any last questions. And so there's one question that came in through the chat, and they said, how can you encourage people to take recovery time, but not create a situation where they're taking too much recovery time?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think it's all just about having an open dialogue and setting expectations. So something that comes to my mind is there are a lot of workplaces that have unlimited vacation, or they don't have any structured system around their vacation time. And for some employees, this can be kind of stressful because they might feel like, oh my gosh, am I taking way too much vacation time, or am I not taking as much vacation time as somebody else and I'm not using it to my advantage? So I think just having conversations about it, just letting people know, because just to the question's point of making sure that people are not taking too much vacation time, I think it's just as important to make sure that there's somebody who's not taking too little vacation time. So I think talking about it openly is a good idea.
That's fantastic. And I think we're just about out of time. If you've got some additional questions, feel free to send them in. You're going to have a quick question at the end of this seminar where I'd love to have you kind of suggest themes for future webinars that we're going to offer. We're putting on a regular series of webinars around safety and health and other key topics in terms of operations and even customer experience. So I encourage you to jump in on that particular theme. If you want to sign up to our newsletter, we've got a free newsletter with lots of great content that's published every single week. Again, at the end, you'll have a chance to register for that free newsletter, nothing commercial, just some great ideas and insight around all of our research in this space. And then finally, as Madison alluded to, we've got a great podcast that's published every 2 weeks on the C-Suite Radio, the largest business network for podcasts in the world, and it's called The Safety Guru. So feel free to sign up for it. You can download it. It's on the Apple Store. It's also on Google Store and all the other podcast apps. And as Madison I highlighted, we have an episode that's coming up in a couple of weeks that's going to be about sleep with Becca Bossois, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the latest research and thinking about this, which really ties into this theme. So thank you so much for joining in today. Have a wonderful, safe day. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you.